July 1944. A French village drowned in eerie silence. No birdsong, no barking dogs, only the void of death waiting to strike. And then the roar of the MG-42 tore the stillness apart in a single heartbeat. An American squad became the hunted. One question burned through the smoke and fire: who truly held the edge in this life or death clash? The American soldier or the German? The July sun pressed down like a weight of molten iron. It was 1944, and France was a land torn apart by war villages, half-abandoned fields, scorched houses scarred by artillery. Into one such town, a squad of American infantry marched cautiously, boots crunching over rubble helmets, catching the glare of light that filtered through ruined roofs. Dust swirled in the heat, and the silence was almost unbearable. The squad leader, a staff sergeant from Boston, tightened his grip on his rifle. His eyes darted from shuttered windows to broken archways. He had grown up in cramped alleyways of the city, brick walls, crowded tenements, the smell of smoke, and fish markets. This place was alien to him. French villages had an unsettling geometry: narrow lanes, low stone houses with gaping windows, walls pockmarked by bullets. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every corner could conceal death. What disturbed him most wasn't what he saw, but what he didn't hear. The usual chorus of life: a barking dog, a crow cawing, even the rustle of leaves in a breeze had vanished. It was a silence that seemed deliberate, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Soldiers call it the stillness before contact. Veterans knew it well: the sudden pause, when the world feels like glass, seconds before it shatters. The sergeant halted. He raised his fist, signaling his men to stop. The squad froze, instantly obedient. These were men hardened by weeks of combat since landing in Normandy, yet their nerves still trembled when silence stretched too long. Sweat dripped down their temples beneath heavy helmets. The sergeant's heart pounded. Was it a bird that hadn't sung? A faint scrape of boots on cobblestones? Or merely the wind playing tricks? He tried to shake the unease, but the longer he stood there, the more certain he became. Something was wrong. And in war, hesitation is fatal. A sharp, tearing roar erupted, shredding the stillness like a blade ripping canvas. The hidden German MG-42 opened fire, its staccato buzzsaw screaming across the street. A single devastating burst centered directly on the American leader. One heartbeat earlier, he had been alive, eyes darting nervously down the lane. The next, his body was torn apart, crumpling like a discarded uniform. The squad's anchor was gone. Chaos followed. Bullets chewed into plaster and stone, spraying dust like storms of ash. The crack and ping of ricochets filled the air as men dove for cover, their shouts drowned by the metallic snarl of the machine gun. The first to fall after their sergeant were the grenadiers, caught in the open before they could even reach for their satchels. A rifleman collapsed beside them, blood soaking into the cobblestones. The rest of the Squad 9 terrified men scattered, flinging themselves into doorways, behind carts, into the jagged skeleton of a wall. The MG-42 howled again, its barrel flashing, spitting destruction. The machine gun was no ordinary weapon. To American ears, it was the sound of dread itself. Firing at over 200 rounds per minute, it could tear through cover flesh and courage alike. Allied soldiers nicknamed it Hitler's buzzsaw, a sound that sent chills down spines across Europe. In the hands of disciplined German gunners, it was almost a force of nature. The Americans, pinned and gasping for breath, returned fire. Rifles cracked, the bar thumped, but their rounds seemed swallowed by the gutted buildings where the enemy hid. Dust filled their mouths, choking them as they pressed against shattered stone. Fear crept in. Men shouted orders, half heard, half obeyed. Some prayed under their breath. In that crucible, the squad had lost not only their leader, but also their sense of direction. Yet survival depended on cohesion, on some spark of order in the storm. Then through the din, one figure moved. The assistant squad leader, a stocky Texan with broad shoulders and a reputation for quick temper, acted without hesitation. He yanked a grenade from his belt, thumbed the pin loose with practiced speed, and hurled it into the open street. His men watched the spinning metal sphere arc through the air, seconds of suspended fate, before it detonated with a thunderous crack. The explosion punched smoke and stone fragments high into the air, a violent curtain between hunter and hunted. "Move," he bellowed, voice raw but commanding. The squad rallied. Through the haze, they surged forward, adrenaline surging in place of fear. Their M1 Garands gleamed in the smoky light bayonets, fixed fingers tight on triggers. The semi-automatic rifles gave them a rare advantage. Unlike the German bolt actions, these weapons fired as fast as the men could squeeze each shot, a lightning-fast echo of American industry. They burst from cover like unleashed hounds, grenades, primed and flung the bar, hammering suppressive bursts into the building, concealing the machine gunner. The Texan roared a battle cry that cut through the chaos, spurring his brothers in arms. The clash was brutal. The Germans, disciplined and experienced, rallied under their NCO, shouting in sharp bursts of Swabian dialect. Their MG-42 stuttered to life again, and suddenly the Americans were caught in a crossfire that no amount of courage could withstand. One rifleman spun backward, another dropped their cries, lost in the cacophony. Yet the Americans fought on, closing the gap, steel meeting flesh. For every man who fell, another lunged forward, driven less by tactics now than by raw survival. Bayonets slashed, grenades burst, and the cobblestones of the French street became a killing ground where history's most modern armies reverted to something primal. Men grappling, firing, bleeding, clawing for breath in the smoke. When the guns fell silent, the price was clear. The American squad had been whittled down to a handful of survivors, bloodied, shaken, and leaderless. The Germans, too, had suffered their advance, blunted, their formation rattled. Both sides had paid in blood for a single moment of hesitation. The Texan stood amidst it, chest-heaving, face streaked with grime. Around him lay men he had joked with only hours earlier, their laughter silenced forever. He clenched his fists, not in triumph, but in grim resolve. War had a way of grinding away illusions. The Americans had shown courage, training, and instinct, but they had also revealed their vulnerability. A single ambush had nearly annihilated them. Their weapons had evened the fight, their discipline kept them moving, but against the relentless firepower of the MG-42, even bravery could only carry them so far. This was not just a skirmish. It was a question, a test. On battlefields across Europe, squads like this one faced their counterparts, German infantry, who fought with precision, cohesion, and reliance on that infernal machine gun. The question was simple, yet enormous in mid-1944. Who truly held the edge, the American infantry squad or the German? The answer would not be found in one battle alone. It demanded a deeper look at weapons, at training, at doctrine, at the psychology of men thrust into hell. The simulation was only beginning. The silence that had weighed so heavily over the town was shattered into a storm of violence. The MG-42's barrel spewed fire, each burst like the ripping of canvas, a metallic growl that dominated the entire street. Its bullets tore through the hot July air with such density that it seemed less like individual rounds and more like a continuous stream of destruction. The squad's staff sergeant, the man who had raised his fist moments earlier to halt his men, barely had time to draw breath before the German gunner's sights settled on him. The burst hit him squarely, cutting him down in an instant. There was no drama in his fall, no drawn-out heroism, just the brutal finality of death in war. One moment he was leading a life watchful, the next a lifeless weight crumpled against the cobblestones. His collapse was more than physical. It was psychological. The anchor of the squad had been ripped away in a heartbeat, and without their leader, the men flinched directionless in the storm. Panic coursed through the ranks as the Germans pressed their advantage. Gunfire rattled from the flanks. Hidden riflemen waiting like coiled serpents squeezed their triggers. An American grenadier, still fumbling for the strap of his satchel, went down with a cry that dissolved into silence. Another rifleman stumbled forward, hit in the chest, his helmet tumbling off as he fell face first into the dust. The squad fragmented. Training clashed with instinct as men bolted in different directions, desperate for any cover. Some dove behind the stone remnants of a low wall. Others crashed through shattered doorways, slamming their backs against splintered wood. Boots skidded on cobblestones, slick with dust and blood. The air was filled with the acrid tang of cordite, the rasp of desperate breaths, the hollow thump of bullets embedding themselves into walls. 9 remained alive. 9 men trapped in a kill zone, their ears ringing, nerves frayed. They clung to cover as the MG-42 chewed into the street around them, sparks leaping from stone shards of masonry raining down. For every second they stayed pinned, their odds of survival diminished. The American reply came scattered but furious. M1 Garands cracked their semi-automatic rhythm rapid and insistent. A bar operator leaned from behind a shattered cart, sending bursts of automatic fire up toward a darkened window. Grenades clinked against belts as men prepared them, though none yet dared to stand and expose themselves long enough to throw. Still, the MG-42 answered every attempt. Its roar was relentless, suppressing any thought of movement. The German squad had planned this ambush meticulously. They had studied the angles, chosen their kill zone, and now exploited the American vulnerability with ruthless precision. This wasn't just firepower. It was doctrine. The German infantry squad of 1944 revolved around the machine gun, particularly the MG-42. Every man in that unit had a role to carry ammunition to protect the gunner, to ensure the weapon never ceased its terrifying chorus. To face them was to face not just soldiers, but a system built to maximize lethality. For the Americans crouched in that French street, the reality of this doctrine was immediate. They weren't facing 10 individuals with rifles. They were facing a single beast, one mechanical heart, one unyielding drumbeat of death. The riflemen on either side were its limbs keeping it alive, feeding it, ensuring it never lost its rhythm. The squad's indecision was costly. With their leader gone, hesitation gripped them like a vice. Do they advance? Do they retreat? Every second wasted meant the Germans could adjust, tighten the trap, and cut them down one by one. The Texan felt at first that suffocating paralysis, the weight of men looking at each other with no orders to follow. His temper, often a curse, now became a strange gift. Anger burned away hesitation. He slammed his palm against the rubble, eyes flashing. His voice tore through the chaos. Grenade out. He didn't wait for permission, because permission no longer existed. He yanked the pin from the oval-shaped fragmentation grenade, feeling its rough grooves under his calloused fingers, and hurled it into the street. Time seemed to slow as the small object spun in the sunlight, a dark speck against the glaring white of dust. The explosion cracked the air like thunder, echoing off ruined walls. Smoke and debris blasted outward, obscuring the German firing lanes. For the first time since the ambush began, the Americans had a sliver of breathing room. "Move, damn it, move!" the Texan roared. Adrenaline surged through the men. Trapped no longer, they clawed their way from cover hearts, pounding every nerve screaming. Some fired blindly into the haze, others lobbed grenades to keep the Germans guessing. A rifleman sprinted forward, his Garand barking, while another provided cover from behind. The bar operator leaned into his weapon, sending a hammering stream of bullets to pin the machine gun nest. The counterattack was as reckless as it was desperate. The Americans weren't merely following orders, they were grasping for survival. Their cohesion was imperfect, their movements frantic, but their courage was undeniable. Inside the haze, chaos reigned. German riflemen shouted commands and clipped bursts of dialect, rallying their machine gun crew. Their NCO barked orders with the authority of experience, pushing his men back into the fight. The MG-42's barrel, briefly silenced, roared again, spewing bullets into the cloud of smoke and flame. The street became a cauldron. The din of battle was almost unbearable. The clatter of rifles, the thump of grenades, the scream of the machine gun. Stone and bricks splintered into fragments, raining down like shrapnel. Smoke mingled with dust, stinging eyes and throats. Men stumbled, slipped, cursed, shouted. 2 Americans went down in the countercharge, cut by crossfire before they could close the distance. Another collapsed to his knees, clutching his stomach as blood seeped through his uniform. Yet the survivors pressed on, teeth, gritted bayonets, fixed lunging through the haze towards silhouettes glimpsed through smoke. For a brief, surreal moment, the modern war dissolved into something older, almost medieval steel against flesh, men locked in mortal struggle at arm's length. A rifle butt crashed against the German's jaw. A bayonet stabbed forward, meeting resistance, then yielding. Grenades burst in confined alleys, collapsing walls onto friend and foe alike. By the time the haze cleared, the ground was littered with bodies. Both sides had paid dearly. The Americans, though battered, had survived the ambush. Their leader was gone, several comrades dead or wounded, yet they still stood. The Germans too had taken losses, casualties that cut into their cohesion, though not enough to break their resolve entirely. And so, as the echoes of gunfire died down, the question lingered like smoke in the air. Was this a victory or merely a reprieve? The Texan looked around at the faces of his men, grimy, blood-streaked eyes, wide with the memory of how close death had been. He knew the truth. It hadn't been tactics that saved them. It had been instinct, raw courage, and the sheer will not to be slaughtered like animals. But in war, those qualities alone were never enough. The Germans would regroup. The machine gun would fire again. And the question, the larger one that hung over all of Europe, remained unresolved between the American infantry squad and their German counterparts who truly held the advantage. This first clash was only the beginning of an answer. The world seemed muted after the storm of gunfire, as though the town itself recoiled from what had just unfolded. Smoke hung in the streets like a dirty curtain, its acrid sting coating the throats of every man still breathing. The echoes of the MG-42's roar still lingered in their ears, a phantom buzzing that made the silence feel unnatural. 9 men remained, 9 out of 12. They crouched low in broken doorways, and behind fractured walls, hearts still racing, eyes darting at every shifting shadow. Their leader was gone. His body sprawled lifeless in the middle of the kill zone. For a moment, none dared look at him. To see him was to admit how fragile they all were. The Texan, chest heaving from the counterattack, pressed his back against a chunk of fallen masonry. He ran a calloused hand over his face, smearing grime and sweat across his cheeks. His grenade had saved them from annihilation, but the cost was plain. He glanced at the bleeding rifleman propped against a doorway, at the grenadier, whose hand still twitched in death, at the splashes of red staining the cobblestones. They had survived, but survival did not feel like victory. One of the riflemen, barely more than a boy with freckles still visible beneath the dirt, muttered to himself as he reloaded. His hands shook, fumbling with the clip. Each metallic click was too loud in the silence. The Texan crouched beside him, grabbed his wrist, and steadied it. "Breathe, kid. Just breathe. You're still here. That's what matters." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, but his wide eyes betrayed the truth. He was rattled to his core. All around them, the town was a ruin of dust and rubble. The blast of grenades had collapsed parts of walls, spilling stones into the streets. Wooden shutters dangled on one hinge, swinging gently in the still air. Plaster dust floated like mist in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through shattered roofs. It looked less like a place where people once lived, and more like a stage for death stripped of humanity. The Germans, though shaken, had not been destroyed. Somewhere among the upper floors of the town's buildings, riflemen crouched waiting for the next opportunity. And somewhere, the MG-42 crew was resetting their position, eager to resume their deadly chorus. Pinned, outnumbered, and leaderless, the Americans did what training had drilled into them. They regrouped. The Texan was not the official squad leader, but in the vacuum of command, men turned instinctively toward decisiveness. He barked low orders, his voice hoarse but steady. 2 riflemen shifted to cover the left flank, watching alleyways that could conceal advancing Germans. The bar gunner found a position behind a broken cart barrel resting on its frame. Another soldier scavenged grenades from the bodies of the fallen, slipping them onto his own belt without a word. They weren't fighting for ground anymore. They were fighting for survival. Yet, beneath the desperation, something else flickered, the quiet force of discipline. The Americans had trained for chaos like this. Though their manuals never spoke of ruined villages or of the silence of dead birds, they taught men to adapt, to hold, to fight, even when leaders fell. This doctrine of adaptability was, in many ways, the soul of the American squad. Unlike the Germans who revolved their tactics around a single weapon, the US placed emphasis on flexibility. Any man could step into command. Any soldier could take initiative if the situation demanded. The Army called it small unit leadership. In practice, it meant the difference between paralysis and action. The Texan raised his head just enough to peer down the lane. His eyes scanned the building where the MG-42 had been firing. Its windows were dark still, but he knew better than to trust silence. He spat into the dust, adjusted his helmet, and turned to his men. "They want us pinned. They want us scared. Don't give them that satisfaction. We move smart, we stay low, we hit them hard. That's how we get out." His words weren't poetry, but they were enough. In war, sometimes belief mattered as much as bullets. The men nodded, adjusting their grips, rechecking their weapons. The familiar weight of the M1 Garand pressed against their shoulders, its walnut stock solid, its metal receiver warm from use. It was a comfort in its way. A weapon that gave each man a voice in the chaos, a voice louder and faster than the bolt-action rifles of their enemies. The bar gunner exhaled slowly, his cheek pressed against the weapon's stock. He knew his role to lay down suppressive fire, to give the others a chance to maneuver. His 20-round magazine was a thin shield against the MG-42's endless belt, but it was a shield nonetheless. Across the street, one of the older privates whispered the name of his wife, as though speaking it aloud would conjure her protection. Another clutched the silver cross at his neck lips, moving silently. War had a way of stripping men bare, revealing what they clung to when the world around them collapsed. Then came the sound. At first faint, the creak of boots on wood, the muffled shuffle of men shifting positions. The Germans were moving again, probing, adjusting. Every American stiffened ears, straining breaths shallow. The Texan raised a hand, signaling silence. His men froze, waiting. In the pause, the town felt alive again, not with life, but with threat. The wind stirred dust, a shutter slammed in the distance, a loose stone clattered from a wall. Each sound could have been nothing, or everything. The machine gun barked again, sudden and vicious. Bullets chewed into their coverstone shards, slicing into exposed skin. The bar answered instantly, its burst thumping into the German nest. Garands cracked in reply, the echoes bouncing down the narrow lanes. Grenades arced once more, exploding in brutal bursts that rattled the very foundations of the ruined homes. It was not order. It was not elegance. It was survival, messy and raw. And yet, within that desperate exchange, the essence of the American squad revealed itself. Even stripped of leadership, even bloodied and cornered, they adapted. They found ways to strike back to claw openings where none existed. Their training did not erase fear, it gave them the tools to fight through it. One soldier, barely 20, reloaded his rifle with a practice snap, then glanced at the Texan. "Sarge would have known what to do," he whispered. The Texan met his eyes. "Then we do it for him." The boy nodded, his jaw set. In that moment, the squad was no longer a broken group of survivors. They were a fighting unit again. Still vulnerable, still bleeding, but bound by the shared determination not to let the ambush be their grave. Around them, the town remained a ruin of stone and shadow, its silent houses watching the carnage unfold. The question lingered over them like smoke. How long could they hold? How long before the MG-42's relentless buzzsaw claimed them all? For now, they endured. And in war, endurance was often the first step toward victory. The next wave came not with the suddenness of the first ambush, but with a simmering inevitability. The Americans knew the MG-42 wasn't finished, and the Germans, drilled and confident, would not simply fade into the ruins. The air vibrated with tension as the squad braced for another assault. The Texan wiped his sleeve across his face, smearing soot and blood across his cheek. He scanned the smoke-choked street, jaw tight, waiting for the chance to strike. His mind wasn't filled with strategy manuals or battlefield theory, just survival instinct and the faces of the men who still depended on him. And then it came the unmistakable rattle of the MG-42, spitting anew bullets, chewing into stone, spraying splinters across their positions. Dust burst into the air like phantom clouds, and once again, the squad felt the weight of the German doctrine, absolute fire superiority through the machine gun. The Texan knew hesitation was death. He acted. His hand shot to his belt fingers, curling around the heavy oval of another fragmentation grenade. The cold steel bit into his palm. He pulled the pin with a practiced jerk of his thumb, the ring clinking faintly against his helmet. For a heartbeat, he held it, feeling the seconds tick inside his hand like a living heart. Then, with a grunt, he hurled it into the kill zone. The grenade spun in the air, catching a brief glint of sun before vanishing into the haze. The explosion came a second later, violent concussive shaking loose plaster from walls and sending a column of dust into the air. The detonation was more than a weapon. It was a message. We will not be pinned.
Go move,
The Texan roared his voice a guttural command that pierced through the chaos. The Americans surged forward, propelled by his fury. They burst from cover rifles, barking in their hands, boots pounding against the stones. It was reckless, yes, but in war, reckless courage sometimes cracked open the iron jaws of death. Their M1 Garand spat fire in rapid rhythm. Bang, 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 each trigger pull unleashing a .30-06 Springfield cartridge with lethal force. The Garand was more than a rifle. It was a revolution in infantry combat, where the Germans were still cycling their carabiner 98K bolt-action rifles, pausing after each shot to chamber another round. The Americans could fire again and again as fast as their fingers could squeeze. In the chaos of a street fight, that difference was measured in lives. Two riflemen advanced side by side, their bayonets fixed, thrusting forward with grim resolve. Another man hurled a grenade overhand the blast, collapsing part of a wall that concealed a German rifleman. Shouts in German rang out sharp-clipped urgent as their NCO scrambled to rally his squad. The bar gunner braced his weapon against a pile of rubble, unleashing suppressive bursts toward the machine gun nest. The bar lacked the sheer ferocity of the MG42, its magazine a meager 20 rounds compared to the endless belt-fed stream of its German counterpart. But in that moment, its stuttering fire was enough to force the gunner's head down. The Texan charged at the head of the counterattack, his face twisted in fury. The smoke from his grenade still clung to the street, cloaking the squad in a shifting veil. He bellowed a sound raw and animal, as though sheer willpower could drive back the German fire. For a moment it worked. The Americans cut down two German riflemen caught out of position, their bodies crumpling amid shattered brick. A third stumbled from cover only to be caught in the crosshairs of three Garands firing in unison. The German line wavered, its cohesion rattled. But the German squad leader was no novice. He had survived campaigns across Russia, Italy, and now France. He barked orders in his Swabian dialect, rallying his men with the voice of experience. Under his direction, the MG42 swung back into action, its muzzle flashing as it carved through the smoke. Bullets tore through the street, snapping overhead, slamming into walls, ricocheting in sparks. One American rifleman pitched forward, his helmet spinning away as blood spread across the stones. Another fell against a doorway, sliding down the frame, his rifle clattering from his limp hands. The Americans had closed the distance, but they were caught in the crossfire. Their momentum faltered, courage colliding with the cold mathematics of machine gun fire. Still, they fought on. A grenadier, teeth clenched, yanked a smoke grenade from his belt and fired it high. The canister hissed as it landed, releasing a thick white cloud that billowed between the two squads. The battlefield dissolved into ghostly shapes and muffled shouts. For seconds, neither side could see the other. Inside the fog, the Americans pressed forward, rifles, raised bayonets glinting faintly. Heartbeats thundered in their ears as they stumbled toward shadows that could be friend or foe. The Texan shouted for his men to keep close, his voice barely carrying over the chaos. Somewhere ahead, the MG42 roared again, blindly spraying into the smoke. The bullets cut through the haze like scythes, and a young private screamed as he was struck, collapsing into the dust. The clash became a frenzy of instinct. A rifle butt swung into a German's jaw. A bayonet thrust forward, meeting resistance, then sliding free with a sickening sound. Grenades burst inside narrow alleys, the shock waves throwing men against crumbling walls. When the smoke finally began to thin, the street was a butcher's yard. The Americans had forced the Germans back, inflicting casualties. Several riflemen lay dead, their lifeless eyes staring skyward. The MG42 team, though rattled, was still in place, their weapon hot, its barrel smoking from overuse. The American squad, though, had been cut nearly in half. Bodies lay sprawled among the ruins, the survivors' panting eyes glazed with exhaustion and shock. The Texan staggered to his feet, his uniform torn, blood streaking his arm from a shallow graze. He looked around at what was left of his squad, half a dozen men, all dirty, shaken, but alive. His eyes flicked to the fallen men he had shared cigarettes and laughter with just hours earlier. There was no time to grieve. He clenched his fists, his chest heaving. He had saved them from annihilation, but at a terrible cost. And deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't victory. It was survival, nothing more. Yet within that desperate struggle, something vital was revealed. The Americans had shown that even under the crushing weight of the MG42, they could adapt. They could regroup. They could strike back with fury and precision using their semi-automatic rifles, their grenades, their sheer determination to close the gap. They weren't invincible, but they were resilient. And that resilience was what set them apart. War was not decided by a single skirmish or by the superiority of one weapon over another. It was decided by the ability of men to endure to fight back when all seemed lost, to find strength in chaos. The German squad had the machine gun. The Americans had the Garand, the bar, and the will to improvise. The battlefield would decide which mattered more. The street became a furnace of noise and smoke. The Texans' grenade had bought them a heartbeat of opportunity, and in war, a heartbeat could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Through the rising dust, the Americans surged forward, men who hours earlier had been marching in weary silence, now transformed into predators lunging at their enemy. The M1 Garands roared with a tempo that matched the pounding of their hearts. Each shot spat a powerful .30-06 cartridge, the recoil hammering shoulders, the metallic ping of spent clips ringing through the haze, like church bells tolling for the dead. To the Germans who still shouldered their Karabiner 98Ks, this rhythm was alien and terrifying. For every one of their shots, the Americans answered with 3. A rifleman named Parker, his face streaked with soot and sweat, charged through the fog with his bayonet fixed. He thrust forward wildly, the blade catching a German rifleman in the shoulder. The man cried out, stumbling back into the rubble. Parker wrenched his weapon free and fired point blank, the force of the shot echoing down the narrow lane. His hands trembled, but his eyes burned with grim determination. Behind him, the bar gunner crouched low, his weapon balanced against the corner of a broken wall. He pressed the trigger, releasing bursts that rattled the air with a slower but steadier cadence. His 20-round magazine felt pitifully small, especially against the endless belts feeding the MG-42. Yet he poured out his fire with cold precision, each burst pinning the German gunners just long enough for his squad mates to close the distance. The Texan, roaring louder than the din of battle, led from the front. His voice was hoarse, but commanding his rage at the ambush, fueling a reckless courage. "Push him back! Don't let up!" He bellowed, his words tearing through the chaos like artillery blasts. Grenades arced through the smoke. One detonated against the corner of a stone house, the blast collapsing part of the wall and sending shards flying in every direction. Another burst inside a doorway, filling the interior with a flash of fire and dust. German shouts rose in panic, some muffled, some sharp with pain. For a moment, the advantage tilted. 2 German riflemen scrambled from cover, coughing through the haze, only to be cut down by a flurry of Garand fire. Another, stunned by the concussive blast of a grenade, staggered into the open. A young American private, his hands still trembling, squeezed the trigger and dropped the man with a single shot. The boy froze for a heartbeat, staring at what he had done before. Another shout from the Texan jolted him back into motion. But war's never so simple. The German NCO, a veteran with hard eyes and a voice that carried authority even through chaos, rallied his men. He barked orders in his dialect, each word sharp as steel. At his command, the MG-42 snapped back to life. Its barrel blazed its roar, dominating the soundscape once more. The weapon's stream of fire scythed through the haze bullets, ricocheting, chipping stone, and splintering wood. The Americans were caught mid-charge. One rifleman spun as the burst struck him, his body jerking before he collapsed lifeless onto the cobblestones. Another fell beside him, his helmet clattering across the street. Blood pooled quickly, staining the dust. The squad, their momentum suddenly broken, was forced to throw themselves flat, scrambling for scraps of cover amid the wreckage. The Texan cursed furiously, slamming his fist against the wall beside him. He had pushed them forward, and now the MG-42 was chewing them apart. His anger, though, kept him moving. He grabbed the nearest man, a terrified private, and shoved him behind a cart. "Stay low. Keep firing." Still, the counterattack was not a failure. Smoke grenades had blanketed parts of the street, creating shifting veils that disoriented the Germans. Within that fog, individual Americans darted and lunged, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. One grenadier, crouching low, flung another grenade through a shattered window. The explosion blasted out the glass and sent the German rifleman inside, tumbling back in a spray of blood and debris. Another American advanced to the corner of a house, pressed his Garand against the wall, and fired blindly around it, suppression by instinct rather than plan, but effective enough to keep the Germans cautious. The clash grew intimate, brutal. Steel met flesh in the narrow lanes. Bayonets flashed and the smoke rifle butt smashed into jaws, boots stamped down onto hands clutching weapons. The fight stripped away any notion of doctrine or theory. It was no longer about which squad was superior on paper. It was about who could endure one more second of hell. Parker, his bayonet still stained, locked eyes with another German just yards away. The two lunged at once, colliding in the haze. The German fired his Kar 98K, the shot grazing Parker's sleeve. Parker rammed forward, driving his bayonet into the man's chest. The scream was choked, muffled by blood, and then silence. Parker staggered back, gasping, staring at the body as though only now realizing what he had done. But there was no time for reflection. A shout pulled him back into the fight. Through it all, the MG-42 remained the beast in the room. Its gunners, disciplined and relentless, fired and burst to prevent overheating. Every time the Americans tried to surge forward, the weapon roared, cutting down the brave and forcing the rest back into cover. It was a cruel rhythm-advanced suppression retreat. By the time the smoke began to thin, the cost was evident. The Americans were fewer now, bloodied and battered. Several lay dead in the street, their rifles abandoned, their bodies twisted in unnatural shapes. The survivors clung to walls and rubble, their faces pale, their eyes hollow with shock. Yet they were still alive, and their presence alone was a testament to resilience. The Germans too had suffered. Several riflemen lay motionless in the ruins. The squad leader's shouts were hoarse now, his men shaken by the ferocity of the American counterattack. They had expected to pin their enemy, to crush them beneath the weight of the MG-42. Instead, they had been dragged into a vicious street fight, paying dearly in blood for their ambush. When the guns finally fell silent, the town seemed to exhale. The smoke drifted upward in lazy curls, revealing a scene of devastation. Bodies lay across the cobblestones, the stones themselves stained red. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, watching silently as men caught their breath, reloaded their weapons, and prepared for whatever came next. The Texan leaned heavily against a wall, his chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He glanced at the men still standing, 5, maybe 6. Their uniforms were torn, their helmets dented, but their eyes met his with grim resolve. They had survived the counterattack, but it had not been without cost. Their sergeant was gone. Several comrades lay dead, and the MG-42 still loomed like a predator waiting for its next chance to strike. Yet in the heart of the chaos, something had been proven: the Americans could fight back. They could adapt, they could meet steel with steel, and refuse to break. The Texan spat into the dust, tightened his grip on his Garand, and muttered under his breath, "Not today." For now, the squad remained. And as long as they remained, the battle was far from over. The smoke drifted upward in lazy columns, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and the coppery tang of blood. The street, once empty and silent, now looked like a scar, its walls pocked and chewed, its cobblestones littered with fragments of men and masonry alike. The echoes of battle were gone, leaving behind only the ragged breathing of survivors and the unsettling buzz of flies already gathering. The Texan leaned his back against a jagged wall, sliding down until he sat heavily in the dust. His chest heaved, sweat soaking through his uniform, and his arms trembled from the adrenaline still coursing through him. He wiped his brow with a grime-stained sleeve and scanned the wreckage of what had once been his squad. 5 remained, 5 out of 12. Some clutched wounds, grimacing as they pressed bandages against bleeding flesh. One sat with his back against a doorframe, his eyes vacant, his rifle lying forgotten across his lap. Another, younger than the rest, busied himself with reloading, mechanical, almost frantic, as though the act of snapping clips into place was the only thing keeping his mind from collapsing under the weight of what he had just endured. The dead lay scattered around them, twisted in unnatural postures. Some still clutched their rifles, as though unwilling to let go even in death. Others stared blankly at the sky, their last expressions frozen in fear or fury. The Texan forced himself to look at each one. To avoid their faces would be to dishonor them. War taught a man many lessons, but the harshest of all was how fragile command could be. One sergeant's hesitation, one wrong step into an ambush, and the entire squad unraveled. The Germans had chosen their ground well, using doctrine honed over years of bitter fighting funnel the enemy into a kill zone, pin them with the machine gun, and let the rest of the squad pick off the survivors. It was efficient, brutal, and frighteningly effective. The Americans had paid dearly for their leader's moment of indecision, yet remarkably, they had not collapsed. Why? Because training had carved into them a simple truth: when one man falls, another steps up. Unlike their German counterparts, the American infantry was not built around a single weapon or even a single leader. Every soldier was expected to think, to act, to improvise. The Texan had not been groomed for command, but in that moment his temper, his courage, and his instincts had filled the void, and his men had followed. Not because they were ordered, but because they trusted action more than silence. It was a defining difference. The German squad revolved around the MG-42. It was both their greatest strength and their glaring weakness. The weapon's sheer rate of fire was unmatched, shredding stone and flesh alike, dominating the battlefield with its terrifying chorus. Allied soldiers who heard its buzzsaw often felt their stomachs drop, knowing they were at the mercy of a weapon that could unleash more than 20 rounds a second. But this reliance also created vulnerability. When the MG-42 was silenced by grenade, by smoke, or by sheer audacity, the German squad lost its spine. Their rifles alone could not match the volume of firepower the Americans could bring with their Garands, bars, and grenades. And without the MG-42, cohesion faltered. The Americans had exploited that weakness, if only briefly. The Texans' grenade had forced the gunners into cover, and in that moment the squad surged forward, closing the distance and striking back. Though the MG-42 eventually recovered, the clash revealed a truth that would echo across countless battlefields: adaptability could offset firepower. Still, the cost was steep. The Texan glanced at Parker, the rifleman, who had fought savagely with his bayonet in the smoke. The young man sat with his back to a wall, his hands trembling violently as he tried to light a cigarette. The match broke once, then twice before finally catching. He inhaled shakily, his eyes staring into the distance. He had killed a man face to face, felt the resistance of flesh on steel and the weight of it pressed down like a leaden cloak. "Hell of a fight, Parker," the Texan muttered. Parker looked up, his lips twitching into a bitter half smile. "Hell of a mess, Sarge." They both knew he wasn't wrong. The Germans, too, had retreated into the shadows, licking their wounds. Their squad leader, though experienced, had lost several men and nearly his position. For all the firepower of the MG-42, they had failed to crush the Americans completely. The encounter was a stalemate drenched in blood, but the lesson was clear: when doctrine clashed with improvisation, neither side walked away unscathed. One private, cradling his wounded arm, whispered, "We should have seen it coming." The Texan shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. We're still breathing. That's what counts." But in the quiet corners of his mind, he knew the truth. The squad had walked straight into a textbook ambush. Their sergeant had hesitated at the wrong moment, and the price had been lives they could never reclaim. The men who followed him into battle would not return home. Their mothers, their wives, their children would mourn them long after this ruined village was forgotten by history. That was the cruelty of war, its merciless indifference. And yet, out of this carnage, the simulation whispered insights. The Americans had weaknesses: hesitation, vulnerability to ambush, reliance on initiative that could crumble under shock. But they also had resilience, an ability to regroup and fight even when stripped of leadership. Their semi-automatic rifles gave them firepower at the individual level that no German rifle could match. Their grenades, their smoke, their willingness to charge headlong into danger allowed them to contest even the dreaded MG-42. The Germans, disciplined and deadly, showed why their doctrine had dominated the early years of the war. Their machine gun was unmatched, their coordination sharp, their NCOs experienced. But their reliance on a single weapon made them brittle. Once disrupted, their cohesion faltered and their advantage slipped away. It was a knife's edge, this balance. Victory and defeat teetered on moments: the flick of a grenade, the scream of a machine gun, the courage of a single man willing to shout "move" when all others froze. The Texan rose slowly, slinging his Garand across his back. His men looked at him waiting. He was not their sergeant by rank, but he was their leader now. "On your feet," he said. His voice was steady, resolute. "We're not done yet." The men obeyed, gathering their weapons, helping the wounded to stand. They were fewer now, diminished but not broken. Each scar they carried, each comrade they left behind, became fuel for the fight ahead. As they moved down the ruined street, their boots crunching on broken stone, the Texan glanced back once at the lifeless body of their fallen sergeant. He gave a brief nod, an unspoken promise. "We'll keep fighting. For you, for all of them." The ruins swallowed them once more, their silhouettes fading into the smoke and shadow. The ambush had ended, but the larger question lingered, echoing like the phantom buzz of the MG-42 in the crucible of mid-1944. Who truly held the edge, the Americans with their adaptability and firepower, or the Germans with their discipline and machine gun doctrine? The answer was not yet clear. But the simulation pressed forward and the truth would be tested again. The gunfire faded, but the story of these clashes was not finished. What had unfolded in the ruined streets of a French village was not only a recreation of mid-1944 combat, but also part of a greater experiment. Behind the vivid smoke and carnage lay an attempt to answer a question historians and soldiers alike had debated for decades in the summer of 1944. Which squad was superior, the American or the German? No single firefight could ever settle it. Real battlefields were messy things, cluttered with variables beyond counting supply shortages, whether artillery tank support, sheer dumb luck. To isolate the squads themselves, to strip away everything but the soldiers, their weapons, and their training required a different tool. That tool was simulation. The architects of this experiment, modern historians, armed not with rifles, but with data set about reconstructing the anatomy of the two squads. They pored over field manuals, after-action reports, veterans' memoirs, and training documents. They studied weapons tables, examining fire rates, ranges, and reliability records. They looked at doctrine, how squads were expected to move, how they were drilled to react under fire, how leaders were instructed to rally their men in the heat of chaos. The German squad, as the research confirmed, was built around its machine gun. The MG-42 was not a mere support weapon, it was the centerpiece. Every rifleman in the squad was trained first and foremost to keep that gun firing, carrying ammunition, guarding its flanks, or replacing the fallen gunner. It was the spearhead and the shield, a terrifying instrument of suppression. The American squad was built differently. Its structure was more balanced, its firepower distributed. The squad leader directed not just a single focal weapon, but a collection of semi-automatic rifles, a Browning automatic rifle, and a scattering of grenades. Each man was a contributor to the fight, each weapon a voice in the chorus. To pit these squads against one another, the historians created a model that ignored the chaos of wider war. No artillery screamed overhead. No tanks rumbled into the fray. No supply lines starved one side or the other. This was infantry against infantry, a stripped-down duel meant to reveal the bones of doctrine and the soul of tactics. Thousands of engagements were run through the program. Each one played out on varied terrain, ruined villages, hedgerows thick with Normandy's greenery, open fields broken by ditches and fences. Variables were randomized. Sometimes the Germans struck first with an ambush. Sometimes the Americans launched a surprise flanking maneuver. Each simulation ran to its bloody conclusion, recording casualties, survival, and patterns. And though the program was modern, its foundation was human. Real accounts of combat flavored the data, soldiers describing how it felt to hear the MG-42's snarl, GIs recalling the comfort of the Garand's steady rhythm, German veterans admitting the terror of American artillery even if it was excluded from the model. It was an attempt to capture not just mathematics but experience. The historians knew their answer would never be final. War was too vast, too unpredictable for certainty, but the purpose was not to settle history with a hammer blow. It was to illuminate tendencies, to sketch the outlines of superiority and weakness, to show where one squad held the edge and where the other faltered. The simulation's design reflected these goals. Each squad was limited to 10 to 12 men armed with the weapon standard for mid-1944. Ammunition was assumed plentiful enough not to run dry in a single engagement, though reloading time and magazine size were faithfully accounted for. Fatigue, morale, and leadership were folded into the model as probabilities reflecting that men were not machines, that fear could paralyze and bravery could surge in unexpected places. The Germans carried their MG-42, several Kar 98K bolt-action rifles, and at least one MP-40 submachine gun in the hands of their squad leader. The Americans bore their M1 Garands, bar grenades, and sometimes a Thompson submachine gun. Every weapon's rate of fire accuracy and effective range was modeled with painstaking care. Beyond weapons, the program emphasized tactics. German squads focused firepower around the MG-42 with the squad leader, directing concentrated volleys at single targets. Americans practiced fire and maneuver, splitting into smaller teams, one element laying down suppressive fire while another advanced. The model tested these doctrines again and again, watching how they fared when theory collided with the chaos of simulated combat. But simulations alone are sterile things lifeless without narrative. That is why the experiment also dramatized 3 chosen clashes, unfolding them in vivid detail: the ambush in the village, the failed German counter, and the climactic fight near the ruined church. These examples, though fictionalized, were built on the bones of data. They were meant not to replace statistics, but to give them flesh to show what those numbers meant when translated into the screams of men and the roar of guns. From the first clash lessons already emerged. The Americans faltered when ambushed, their leader falling in the first burst, yet training allowed them to regroup. The Texan's grenade and his sheer defiance revealed the squad's adaptability. They had been mauled, but they had not been annihilated. The Germans, for their part, had executed their doctrine flawlessly, pinning the enemy, exploiting confusion, pressing their machine gun advantage. But they had also shown the brittleness of their reliance on the MG-42. When forced even briefly into cover, their formation staggered, their dominance shaken. The analysts did not judge these outcomes as victories or defeats alone. Instead, they marked them as fragments of truth puzzle pieces in a larger picture. In some engagements, German firepower shredded American ranks before they could respond. In others, American cohesion and rapid rifle fire overwhelmed German positions once the MG-42 was silenced. The margin between triumph and slaughter was razor thin. And so, as the simulation churned, it promised to reveal more than statistics. It promised to show the heartbeat of 2 armies, how they fought, how they endured, how they broke. Each engagement was not just numbers flashing across a screen, but a story of men thrown into desperate struggles, their fate hinging on weapons training and courage. The next scenario would prove it. Once more the battlefield would ignite, and once more the squads would clash. The lesson would not be abstract. It would be written in gunfire, smoke, and blood. The simulation was only beginning to speak. A sudden shout pierced the haze of war. It was not words the Americans recognized, but tone alone was enough to communicate danger. Instinct overrode thought. Every man dove for the nearest cover boots, scraping across cobblestones, rifles clutched tight against their chests. The MG-42 snarled again, bullets slashing through the space they had occupied just seconds earlier. Sparks leapt from walls as the buzzsaw chewed into stone, sending fragments slicing into exposed skin. For at least 6 men, that panicked leap had saved their lives. Had they hesitated even half a heartbeat longer, they would have been cut down where they stood. The German squad leader barked curses in his Swabian dialect, frustrated that his prey had escaped the opening volley. He steadied himself, recalling the principles drilled into him since his first days of training. Fire superiority was everything. The MG-42 was the squad's beating heart, and he could not afford to burn it out too quickly. Bursts, he shouted, gesturing sharply with his hand. The gunner obeyed the weapon's terrifying stream, shifting into shorter, more measured roars. Across the street, the Americans pressed their backs against cover, ears ringing. Dust and smoke swirled around them, obscuring vision, but they could hear the steel rhythm of the MG-42 hammering at their nerves. One private closed his eyes, whispering a prayer. Another gritted his teeth, muttering, "Not again, not like this." Then came the answer, the deep, cracking retort of the M1 Garand. The Americans returned fire, their rifles sending rounds snapping through the haze. The bar thumped in steady rhythm, adding its slower but weightier bursts to the defiant chorus. The battle became a duel of doctrines. The Germans worked as they had been taught, concentrating their firepower on single targets, focusing every rifle and every burst of the MG-42 on whichever American dared to expose himself. Their coordination was chilling, honed by years of war. Bullets laced into one wall, then swung to a window, then stitched across a broken cart. It was controlled fury. The Americans, by contrast, spread their fire. Their squad leader, one of the few still uninjured, raised his voice above the din. Teams of 3 move and fire. His orders came quick and sharp, slicing through the chaos. He split his men into smaller elements, each tasked with a different angle of attack. One group drew fire with suppressive shots, while the others shifted through alleys and ruined interiors seeking flanking positions. It was doctrine forged from a different philosophy. Where the Germans trusted the dominance of one weapon, the Americans trusted flexibility, men thinking on their feet, groups moving like cogs in a machine, overlapping and supporting one another. The clash was immediate. On the right flank, a nervous rifleman scrambled forward, his boots slipping on loose cobblestones. He stumbled, falling hard against the wall of a house. In his panic, his finger tightened on the trigger, and his Garand fired wildly into the air. The shot cracked like a whip, shattering the fragile concealment of his movement. The Germans reacted instantly. Several riflemen swung their muzzles toward the sound, firing in quick succession. Bullets smacked into the stones around the young American, showering him with dust. He flattened himself against the wall, heart hammering in his chest, certain death was seconds away. Only the quick reaction of his comrades saved him. From the center, the bar gunner unleashed a furious stream of suppressive fire, forcing the Germans to duck behind their cover. 2 riflemen added their shots, cracking down the street to keep enemy heads low. The young soldier scrambled back, gasping his mistake burned into his memory. But the danger was not over. The German squad leader, sharper than most, sensed the rhythm of the fight shifting. His eyes flicked from the suppressed MG-42 to the flanking Americans. He realized the danger they were being encircled. If the Americans closed in, the machine gun's superiority would vanish in the smoke and rubble of close combat. He raised his MP-40, its stick magazine jutting downward, and opened fire, spraying bursts toward the approaching flankers. The chatter of his weapon echoed down the street, sharper and harsher than the Garand's rhythm. The Americans ducked one man, falling with a shout, as a round tore into his thigh. Blood soaked through his trousers as his comrades dragged him back behind cover. The German squad leader advanced, firing steadily, his voice urging his men to press forward. But the Americans were not beaten. A grenadier crouched low, pulled the pin on a smoke grenade. He lobbed it in a high arc, the canister hissing as it landed. Thick white smoke poured forth, a rolling curtain that swallowed the street. The German leader cursed as his vision vanished, the world reduced to shadows and echoes. Through the fog, the Americans advanced again. One grenadier hurled a fragmentation grenade beyond the smoke, guessing at the enemy's position. The blast rocked the street, its shockwave shaking loose chunks of plaster. By sheer chance, or perhaps fate, it struck true. The German squad leader crumpled to the ground, shrapnel tearing into his chest. The Germans faltered. Their cohesion cracked. The MG-42 spat blindly into the haze, its bullets slicing through smoke, striking nothing but empty air and broken walls. The Americans pressed forward, their silhouettes emerging like phantoms. One was struck down by a stray burst, collapsing in the fog, but the rest kept moving, their rifles steady, their bayonets gleaming faintly. When they closed the gap, the fight was brutal and short. A German rifleman cornered, dropped his weapon, and raised his hands. Another was clubbed with a rifle butt before he could react. The remaining men, leaderless and surrounded, surrendered. The once dominant MG-42 fell silent. Its crew, captured, its terrifying song ended for now. As the smoke drifted upward, the street revealed its truth. The Americans stood bruised and bloodied, but victorious. Their tactics, fire and maneuver, adaptability, dispersal of fire, had countered the concentrated fury of the German squad. Where one doctrine emphasized the might of a single weapon, the other spread strength across every man. and in this clash, the latter had triumphed. Yet, victory was not without cost. 3 Americans lay dead, 2 more wounded. Their faces were as pale as the plaster dust that coated their uniforms. Even in triumph, the squad was diminished. The Texan spat into the rubble, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter if you win," he muttered, "the bastards still take their pound of flesh." His words carried more weight than he realized. This was no clean simulation, no neat chart of statistics. It was blood and fear and survival. And even when tactics worked, even when doctrine proved sound, men still died. The historians watching this recreated clash would note the tactical lesson American fire and move had effectively neutralized the German reliance on the MG-42. But the soldiers in the simulation, those conjured shadows of 1944, knew another lesson. Victory was not glory. It was simply living one more day. The question remained. 2 clashes, 2 very different outcomes. One ambush nearly destroyed the Americans. Another saw them triumph with grit and tactics. Which side was superior? The answer was still elusive, still clouded in smoke and blood. And so the simulation prepared to play out its third and final engagement, one that would decide, if only narrowly, which squad truly held the edge in 1944. The battlefield had shifted. Where moments earlier the Americans had been pinned beneath the merciless roar of the MG-42, now the initiative was theirs. The smoke still clung to the ruined street, curling in lazy tendrils. But within that haze, the Americans began to reveal their true strength, not just their grit, but their firepower. The M1 Garand sang in quick, steady rhythm. Each pull of the trigger was answered by the sharp crack of a .30-06 Springfield round flying downrange. Its semi-automatic action gave the Americans a decisive advantage. No clumsy pause to work a bolt, no fumbling for breath between shots. Just a relentless sequence, aim, fire, aim, fire. The sound of clips pinging free as they ejected was the background music of this fight. Each metallic note marking 8 rounds expended, and another clip slammed home. For the Germans crouched behind rubble and shattered shutters, the psychological effect was devastating. They were used to the deliberate pace of their own Carabiner 98K rifles, accurate, yes, but slow, each shot demanding a pause. Against the steady drumbeat of the Garand, it felt like facing a tide, each wave harder to resist than the last. One American rifleman braced himself against the corner of a house, his cheek pressed to the stock eyes, narrowed through the sights. He squeezed again and again, his shots driving a German rifleman back from a window. Another crouched in the rubble of a collapsed cart, firing methodically, his barrel heating as he laid down a constant pressure. It was not just marksmanship, it was dominance through rhythm. Then came the deeper voice, the bar. The Browning automatic rifle was no buzzsaw, no rival to the MG-42 in sheer terror. But in the hands of a disciplined gunner, it became a keystone of American squads. With its 20-round magazine and weighty recoil, it demanded patience, trigger discipline. But when fired in bursts, it barked with authority, its rounds tearing into cover and forcing German heads down. The bar gunner of this squad, an older corporal with a face like weathered leather, settled himself into position. His elbows braced on stone, he leaned into the recoil, sending bursts downrange with careful rhythm. Covering fire, he shouted, and his weapon answered with stuttering thunder. Plaster exploded from walls where his round struck, showering the street with white dust. The Germans flinched. The MG-42 team hesitated, forced to duck as the bar's fire raked their position. For a fleeting moment, the balance tipped. The American squad leader seized it. He leaned from cover, his Thompson submachine gun spitting bursts down the lane. The Chicago typewriter, as the men called it, roared at 700 rounds per minute, its stick magazine feeding a spray of lead into the haze. The weapon was short-ranged, unreliable at distance, but in these close-quartered ruins, it was perfect. Its chatter suppressed the German flank, buying his men time. "Teams forward, keep moving," he barked. The squad split into 3 elements. One stayed back with the bar hammering at the German nest. The second darted across the street, vaulting over broken beams and rubble, sprinting through the haze. The third pressed down the center, advancing cautiously with rifles raised, covering one another in short bounds. It was doctrine, come alive. Fire and maneuver. One team suppressed another advance, then roles reversed. Like a deadly dance, every step covered by another's rhythm. The Germans answered with discipline. Their squad leader, still alive, shouted orders directing his men to concentrate their fire on the advancing flankers. Rifle shots cracked, and one American staggered as a bullet tore through his arm. Another was caught in the open, struck in the chest, his body jerking violently before collapsing face first into the stones. But the Americans pressed on. Grenades arced through the haze, detonating with sharp concussions that rattled windows and blew open shutters. A German rifleman was hurled backward by the blast, his body disappearing into the ruins. Another dazed stumbled into the open and was cut down by a trio of Garand shots in quick succession. Through the chaos, the bar kept talking, its bursts measured, deliberate, relentless. The corporal reloaded with practiced speed, slamming in another heavy magazine, then pressed the trigger again. His weapon's voice was not frantic, but steady like the heartbeat of the squad itself. The Germans, rattled, found themselves under pressure on every side. Their machine gun crew still fired, but the smoke and suppression kept them from dominating as before. They fired in bursts, then ducked, then fired again, but each pause stretched longer. Their barrel glowed, their nerves frayed. The American squad leader pressed the advantage. He raised his Thompson again, sprang another burst to pin the Germans, then shouted, "Left team, flank them now." On the flank, 2 riflemen and a grenadier pushed forward, hugging the wall of a ruined house. Their boots slipped on rubble, their lungs burned from the smoke, but they moved with purpose. One paused, fired a quick shot, then moved again, while his comrade covered him. The grenadier pulled another grenade from his belt, the pin clinking as he yanked it free, then hurled it into a shadowed doorway. The explosion shook the building and a German scream followed. They were closing in. The German squad leader realized the danger. He barked orders, his MP-40 spitting as he tried to stem the American tide. His men obeyed, some shifting to support the machine gun, others firing desperately at the flanking Americans. But his eyes betrayed the truth. His squad was being stretched too thin, pulled in too many directions. Their doctrine demanded focus, but their enemy had scattered their attention. One American rifleman fell as the German squad leader's MP-40 found its mark, the burst tearing into his chest. But before the German could press further, the bar thundered again, its round smashing into the wall beside him. Shards of stone sprayed his face, forcing him back. In the center, the Americans surged. Garands barked in rapid succession, their bayonets glinting as they closed the distance. The squad leader Thompson, still in hand, charged forward, his men at his heels. The Germans fired back desperately. A rifleman chambered round after round, his bolt clacking furiously. But the semi-automatic storm of Garand fire was too much. He dropped his weapon, slipping from his hands. The MG-42 roared one last time, its stream cutting down another American, but then a grenade exploded near its nest. The gunners were thrown backward, their weapon falling silent. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged breaths of survivors and the crackle of small fires licking at shattered beams. The Americans stood fewer than before, but victorious in this clash. They had not overwhelmed the Germans with sheer numbers or brute force. They had done so through adaptability, through weapons that allowed each man to act as more than just a yee in a machine. The Garand had spoken in relentless rhythm, the bar had anchored their advance, and the Thompson had covered their flanks. Fire and maneuver had shattered concentration of fire. But the cost was still heavy. 3 more Americans lay still, their lifeless forms sprawled among rubble. The survivors leaned against walls, gasping for air, their faces pale with exhaustion. Victory here was a narrow thing, and they all knew it. The Texan, wiping soot from his brow, muttered, "Doesn't matter how good the gun is. It's the man behind it that decides who walks away." And perhaps in that moment he captured the truth that neither data nor doctrine alone could explain. Weapons mattered. Training mattered. But in the end, it was the will to fight, to adapt, to endure that turned the tide. This battle had shown what American firepower could achieve. But the war of doctrines was not over. Ahead lay another clash, another proving ground, one that would push both squads to their limits and reveal, if only narrowly, who truly held the edge. The Americans had momentum. Smoke grenades had masked their movements. Their Garands kept the Germans pinned, and the bar roared in steady bursts that gnawed at the enemy's nerves. For a moment, it looked as though the tide had fully turned. But in battle, victory is never secure. Sometimes, all it takes is one mistake, a single misstep to unravel everything. That mistake came on the right flank. A young rifleman, barely 20, had been moving with his fire team along the cracked wall of a ruined bakery. His helmet sat crooked on his head, sweat dripping into his eyes. The adrenaline that had carried him through the charge now made his hands clumsy, his heart hammering too fast. His orders were simple: keep low, move when covered, and keep his finger clear of the trigger until ready to fire. But fear has a way of clouding even drilled instincts. He stumbled. His boot caught on a loose cobblestone, pitching him forward into the dust. His rifle clattered, and in his panic, he tightened his grip. The Garand fired with a deafening crack, the shot echoing down the narrow street. The accidental discharge was more than noise. It was a signal. The Germans, already jittery under fire, snapped toward the sound like predators scenting blood. For an instant, all eyes and rifles turned from the suppressive barrage of the bar and Garands in the center to the vulnerable flank. Bullets smacked against the wall where the young rifleman scrambled, showering him with stone fragments. He pressed himself flat, his lungs screaming as death reigned around him. The American squad leader cursed. That single gunshot had exposed the entire flanking maneuver. "Cover the right! Cover the right!" he barked as Thompson, spitting short bursts toward the Germans. The Bayard swung its muzzle, hammering the flank with suppressive fire, but the German squad leader had already seized the moment. He barked orders in his guttural dialect, pointing sharply at the exposed Americans. Several riflemen shifted instantly, aiming not at the main body of the squad, but at the 7 men creeping along the flank. The MG-42 hesitated, its crew uncertain whether to stay fixed on the central advance or to pivot. The German leader shouted again, this time more urgently, and the weapon shifted. The buzzsaw roared its bursts, cutting across the flank bullets, stitching lines across stone and dirt. The Americans, caught in the open, were suddenly fighting for their lives. 2 men went down immediately. One crumpled with a cry, clutching his leg as blood poured from a wound that soaked his trousers. Another was struck in the chest, knocked backward into the rubble, his Garand skittering across the stones. The others threw themselves desperately against the wall, hugging cover, but the MG-42's stream of fire pinned them mercilessly. The young rifleman who had fired the accidental shot pressed his face into the dust, his entire body trembling. He had survived for now, but his mistake had nearly doomed them all. The German squad leader saw the opening clearly. He raised his MP-40 and advanced firing bursts that echoed through the street. His men followed, rifle bolts clacking as they chambered rounds, concentrating their fire on the pinned flankers. The Americans in the center responded instantly. Their squad leader, refusing to let the flank collapse, barked fresh orders. "Keep them pinned, don't let them close." His Thompson shattered his rounds, spraying across the German advance. The bar gunner teeth clenched, reloaded furiously, and opened fire again, bursts hammering into the rubble where the MG-42 crouched. But even with their cover fire, the flank was fragile. Pinned under the weight of the MG-42, the flanking team had little room to maneuver. Every attempt to peek out was met with a hail of bullets. The grenadier tried to lob a grenade around the corner, but the weapon detonated too far from its target, shaking the ground, but doing little to halt the German push. Then salvation came not from brute force, but from smoke and luck. One grenadier, fumbling with shaking hands, loaded a smoke round into his launcher and fired it high into the air. The canister hissed as it landed, spewing thick white smoke that rolled across the flank. The Germans fired blindly into the cloud, their shots wild, while the Americans scrambled to reposition. Through the haze, another grenade arced, this one a fragmentation round that landed just beyond the smoke. The explosion was deafening, a shockwave that tore through the German line. When the dust settled, their squad leader lay crumpled shrapnel embedded deep in his chest. For a heartbeat, the battlefield froze. Leaderless, the Germans faltered. Their MG-42 roared defiantly, but without direction. Its fire grew erratic bursts, chewing up empty stone rather than cutting into the flank. Riflemen hesitated, unsure where to aim, their coordination fractured. The Americans seized the chance. The central squad advanced, Garand snapping in rapid sequence. Each rifleman fired with grim focus, their shots suppressing and eliminating targets one by one. The bar hammered relentlessly, the gunner roaring with every burst as though sheer willpower could keep his weapon fed forever. The flanking team, though battered, rallied behind the smoke. 2 riflemen emerged from the haze, firing steady shots that struck German positions. Another hurled his last grenade, the blast forcing the MG-42 crew to duck. The tide turned once more, but even in triumph, the Americans bled. 3 lay dead on the flank, their bodies sprawled among the stones. Another groaned in agony, clutching a shattered leg. Their squad had survived the German counterattack, but the cost of one mistake had been steep. The young rifleman who had fired the accidental shot sat trembling his rifle across his knees. His comrades didn't speak to him, but their glances carried the weight of what nearly happened. He knew it too. His blunder had drawn fire onto them all, nearly breaking the flank. Yet war had spared him, at least for now. The German squad, for all its discipline, had revealed its own flaw. Their doctrine demanded focus around the machine gun and the authority of a strong leader. When that leader fell, their cohesion cracked. Their MG-42 still barked, but its voice was hollow without direction. By the time the smoke cleared, the Americans were bloodied, but standing. The Germans scattered and disorganized, fell back, or surrendered. The battlefield was once again silent, save for the moans of the wounded and the rasping breaths of survivors. The American squad leader leaned against a wall, his Thompson smoking, his face streaked with soot. He knew the truth. They had survived because the Germans had lost their leader. Without him, the MG-42 was just another weapon. With him, it had nearly crushed them. He exhaled slowly, scanning the ruined street. One mistake, he muttered, and they nearly had us. It was not bravado. It was fact. The line between survival and annihilation had been no thicker than a boot catching a loose stone. This was the reality of mid-1944 combat. American adaptability and firepower could overcome even the fearsome MG-42. But a single error, a stumble, a shot too soon, a burst too long could tilt the balance and cost lives. The simulation continued, recording every exchange, every casualty, every lesson, and the lessons were sobering. Neither side was invincible. Both carried strengths and vulnerabilities, and both could be undone in an instant by chance error or a single well-placed shot. The war of doctrines was far from settled. Ahead lay another clash, one that would test both squads not just in firepower and maneuver, but in endurance. The ruins of France would host another brutal contest where survival would again hinge on seconds and choices. The story was not finished. The air was thick with cordite and fear. The German squad had nearly turned the battle with their ferocious counterfire, but then the Americans responded with smoke. The canister hissed like a serpent as it rolled across the broken cobblestones, belching white plumes that billowed into the street. In seconds, the clear lines of fire vanished, the world swallowed in a ghostly curtain. For both sides, the battlefield became unrecognizable. Vision shrank to mere feet. Shadows darted through the fog shapes that might have been friend or foe. The crack of rifles and the thump of boots echoed strangely, bouncing off walls and vanishing into the haze. The Germans cursed. Their doctrine revolved around the MG-42's dominance, but a machine gun was a weapon of sightlines and fields of fire. In this blinding shroud, it was crippled. The gunner fired wildly into the fog, his burst tearing into empty air, each round wasted ammunition that rattled harmlessly off stone. Without clear targets, their spearhead dulled. The Americans, by contrast, had trained for this. Smoke was their ally, a tool drilled into them during countless exercises. They had been taught to use it not just as cover, but as deception, masking their true movement, creating doubt in enemy minds. Now that doctrine came alive. On the left, a grenadier crouched low, eyes watering from the sting of phosphorus smoke. He adjusted his launcher, angled it upward, and fired another round beyond the first. The canister arced and landed just a few feet past the German position. The hiss of smoke was quickly followed by the thunder of fragmentation. By sheer chance, or perhaps by the cold arithmetic of probability, the grenade struck true. The German squad leader, veteran of years of campaigns, the man whose barked commands had rallied his squad again and again, fell. Shrapnel ripped through his chest, tearing his words from the battlefield forever. His men shouted in shock, their discipline wavering. In an instant, the German line cracked. Their leader had been their compass, their anchor. Without him, the precision of their doctrine faltered. The Americans sensed the shift. The squad leader, his Thompson still warm, yelled over the chaos, "Advance, push through." His words cut like lightning through the fog, and his men responded. They plunged into the smoke bayonets, fixed Garand's raised grenades clutched in sweaty hands. From the center, the bar thundered again, bursts hammering into the MG-42's nest. The gunners ducked low, their weapons' dominance reduced to frantic survival. The smoke had robbed them of superiority. The BR was now their equal, even their better. On the left, 2 riflemen darted forward shadows in the haze. They advanced in bounding leaps, one firing the other, sprinting, then switching. Their Garands cracked in rapid sequence, suppressing the Germans who scrambled without their leader's guidance. On the right, the flankers still shaken by the earlier blunder rallied. One, his sleeves soaked with blood from a grazing wound, hurled his last grenade through the fog. The explosion rocked a German position, sending a rifleman tumbling into the dust. Another rifleman fired a bayonet charge, thrusting his blade into the haze. The blade struck home the cry of a wounded German, confirming his grim success. The fight devolved into chaos. In the haze, men collided at arm's length, fighting hand to hand. Rifle butts smashed into faces, knives flashed bayonets, thrust fists swung. The MG-42 fired one last desperate burst before a Garand round punched through its shield and struck the loader. The gunner cursed, grabbed the weapon's grips, and fired blindly, only to be silenced by another grenade. When the smoke finally began to thin, the street revealed a new order. The Germans were broken, their squad leader dead, their machine guns silenced, their cohesion gone. Some threw down their rifles and raised their hands, palms trembling in surrender. Others fled into the ruins, vanishing like phantoms, leaving their comrades behind. A few lay sprawled where they had fallen, their lifeless eyes staring upward through drifting smoke. The Americans, though battered and bleeding, stood victorious. Their squad leader lowered his Thompson chest, heaving his eyes, scanning the field. He counted quickly, too quickly, and realized the price. 2 more of his men lay motionless, their bodies still. Another leaned heavily against a wall, blood seeping through a bandage wrapped hastily around his thigh. But they had won. Against the terrifying firepower of the MG-42, against the disciplined volleys of German rifles, against the chaos of their own near disaster, they had pressed forward and broken the line. It had not been clean. It had not been glorious. It had been desperate, messy, and costly, but it had worked. The lesson was written in smoke and blood. The German squad was lethal when intact, when its leader commanded and its machine gun dominated. But take away that anchor, blind its weapon, and its edge dulled sharply. The Americans, with their distributed firepower and adaptability, could seize that weakness and drive it home. The Texan, his face streaked with grime, his arm bandaged roughly, leaned against a wall and spat into the dust. He glanced at the young rifleman who had fired the accidental shot earlier. The boy's face was pale, his hands trembling as he reloaded his rifle with shaking fingers. "You're still here," the Texan said quietly. His tone wasn't gentle. It was rough gruff, but not without meaning. "Don't waste it." The boy nodded, eyes wide, guilt and relief mingling in his gaze. The squad gathered what remained of them. They scavenged ammunition from the fallen, both friend and foe, reloading their weapons in silence. The smoke drifted upward, revealing the ruined street, the broken windows, the shattered homes. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a graveyard. And yet, in that graveyard, the Americans had triumphed. It was a triumph that revealed more than tactics. It revealed the essence of the squads themselves. The Germans could strike with terrifying precision, their machine gun roaring like a beast, their doctrine cold and efficient. But they were brittle, vulnerable when their structure cracked. The Americans scattered and battered, though they were proved resilient. They could adapt, they could recover, they could seize fleeting opportunities. This engagement had not been decided by weapons alone. It had been decided by will, by adaptability, by the split-second choices of men in the fog. The simulation recorded the outcome, marking the Germans as defeated in this clash. But the program also logged the cost, the heavy American casualties, the knife's edge upon which victory balanced. It was not a story of dominance. It was a story of survival. As the squad limped forward, leaving behind the silence of the ruined street, one thought lingered in every mind: the fight was far from over. The next clash might not be so merciful. And in the great tally of the simulation, each battle, each bloody, desperate struggle would add to the final reckoning who truly held the edge in 1944. For now, the Americans had prevailed, but tomorrow it might be different. The smoke thinned, and the silence that followed was not peace. It was surrender. The Germans, who still clutched rifles, looked around in disarray, their leader lying dead in the rubble, their vaunted MG-42 silent, its barrel still smoking but useless without its crew. A few clung stubbornly to cover firing sporadic shots that went nowhere, but the fight had already left them. The Americans advanced carefully, rifles raised, bayonets glinting. Their movements were no longer frantic, no longer the desperate scramble of men under ambush. They were deliberate, cautious, the confidence of survivors who knew they had broken the enemy's back. "Hands up!" the squad leader shouted, his Thompson steady in his grip. His voice carried authority, now the kind forged in fire. One German rifleman, his face streaked with soot and blood, slowly laid his weapon down and lifted his arms. Another shaking followed suit, his eyes darting between the Americans and the lifeless body of his sergeant. A third simply dropped to his knees, tossing his rifle aside, muttering words that none of the Americans understood, but all could guess enough. Others fled. In ones and twos, they slipped into alleys, vanishing into the warren of ruined houses. They left their comrades behind, perhaps hoping to rejoin another unit, perhaps simply hoping to survive. Their departure mattered little. The squad, once a cohesive instrument of doctrine, was now shattered. For the Americans, it was a strange moment. They had been seconds from annihilation. They had watched comrades fall, felt the bite of the MG-42's fire, heard the last cries of men they had known since basic training. Yet now, in the same streets where death had stalked them, they stood victorious. The Texan lowered his Garand, slowly scanning the scene with eyes narrowed. His breath still came hard, his heart still pounded, but he allowed himself a grim nod. "They're done," he muttered. Parker, the rifleman, who had fought hand-to-hand in the smoke, leaned against a wall, his chest heaving. His bayonet was still stained, his hands shaking as he wiped them on his trousers. "Doesn't feel like winning," he said quietly. No one disagreed. The Americans moved among the surrendered Germans, stripping them of weapons, gathering them into a corner of the street. Their prisoners were silent eyes, downcast, shoulders slumped. They were not cowards. They had fought with discipline and fury, but they had been broken. Their doctrine outmatched their cohesion, shattered. And therein lay the lesson. The German squad had relied on the MG-42. It was their centerpiece, their god of war, the weapon around which all others revolved. When it dominated, the squad was terrifying. Its roar could pin entire units. Its fire could shred cover. Its presence could dictate the flow of battle. But when it faltered, when grenades and smoke forced it down, when its crew was silenced, everything else fell apart. The rifles alone could not match the volume or speed of American semi-automatics. Their doctrine left them brittle. The Americans, by contrast, spread their strength across the squad. Every Garand was a force multiplier, every man capable of laying down rapid fire. The Bayard, though no MG-42, provided a backbone of suppression. Grenades, smoke, and the Thompson submachine gun gave them tools for close combat and deception. Most importantly, their doctrine encouraged adaptability. When the sergeant fell, another stepped up. When the flank faltered, they rallied. When the smoke blinded the battlefield, they pressed forward instead of hesitating. It was the difference between rigidity and resilience. The battlefield proved it. The Germans had struck hard, nearly broken the Americans. But once their leader fell, once their machine gun was neutralized, their resistance collapsed. The Americans endured, adapted, and triumphed. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. The Americans gathered their wounded. One man, his leg mangled by shrapnel, bit down on a strip of cloth as his comrades tied a tourniquet above the wound. Another, his arm bloodied, winced as Parker wrapped a field dressing around it. The dead were laid gently to the side, their helmets removed, their faces covered with scraps of cloth. The squad leader watched it all, his face set, his jaw clenched. He did not allow himself to grieve, not yet. That would come later if it came at all. For now, his duty was to the living. "Reload," he ordered. "Check your gear, we move soon." The men obeyed, though their movements were weary. Clips snapped into Garand's magazines, slid into BR's and Thompson's. Grenades were checked, belts, tightened boots adjusted. War allowed no pause. Another street, another ambush, another fight could come at any moment. Still in the quiet that followed, reflection crept in. This engagement had shown clearly the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. The Germans wielded fearsome firepower but lacked flexibility. The Americans suffered from vulnerability to ambush and the chaos of lost leaders, but their adaptability and distributed firepower made them dangerous opponents once they regained footing. It was no simple contest of better or worse. It was a clash of philosophies. The German doctrine, born from years of warfare across Europe, emphasized overwhelming fire at a point of decision. The MG-42 was the spear and the squad its shaft. Strike first, strike hard, and victory followed. The American doctrine, shaped by industrial might and a different vision of combat, emphasized every man as a contributor. The Garand was the great equalizer, giving each soldier the ability to fire rapidly, to cover his comrades, to press forward with confidence. Their squads were not as elegant in design, not as terrifying in concentrated power, but they were resilient, and resilience often decided who walked away alive. The historians who later studied this simulation would note these lessons carefully. They would chart casualty ratios, tally the outcomes of thousands of engagements, and seek patterns in the chaos. But for the men in the smoke-filled street, the lesson was simpler. Survival was earned through adaptability, not perfection. The Americans regrouped their prisoners, secured their wounded, stabilized as best as field dressings allowed. The Texan slung his Garand across his back and helped lift a wounded comrade to his feet. Parker sat in silence, staring at his blood-stained bayonet, before finally cleaning it with a rag, his hands trembling. Above them, the sky was awash out gray clouds, drifting lazily as though unaware of the carnage below. The world moved on indifferent. But within the ruined French town, the echoes of doctrine had clashed and broken, and for this moment the Americans stood. They had proven that even against the most fearsome machine gun of the war, even against discipline honed by years of combat adaptability, could triumph. It was not easy. It was not clean, but it was enough. The next battle would tell a different story. The air was different this time. Not the heavy stillness of a sun-scorched July street, nor the choking haze of smoke grenades, but something colder, steadier, more relentless. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on helmets, seeping into uniforms, slicking cobblestones, until they gleamed under the gray morning light. The summer heat of France had broken into a downpour, the kind that turned ruins into rivers and rifles into burdens of damp steel. Through this curtain of rain marched a German squad, their boots splashed in shallow puddles, their breath visible in the chill. They moved with brisk efficiency, their weapons cradled close, their eyes scanning the fog that curled around the shattered remains of a village. The ruins of a church loomed ahead. Its bell tower cracked, its nave half collapsed, its once holy stones scarred by artillery. The squad leader raised a hand, signaling a halt. They would pause here, regroup, catch their breath before pressing on. But the rain concealed more than mud and rubble. A crack split the air, a single shot, sharp and decisive. An M1 Garand's report echoed through the mist, its sound magnified by the silence that preceded it. One German rifleman staggered, then fell into the puddle's water, and blood mixing beneath him. The squad froze, instincts firing at once. Ambush. The Americans erupted from cover, their Garands barking in rapid succession. Bullets tore through the downpour, splashing into puddles, striking stone, finding flesh. The Germans dove behind the rubble of the ruined church, their discipline intact, even in shock. Their squad leader bellowed commands, pointing sharply toward the cracked bell tower. MG-42 Hoch. The machine gun team obeyed instantly, scrambling up the slick steps of the ruined tower. Within seconds, the buzzsaw voice of the MG-42 thundered to life. Its burst slashed through the rain, tearing into the Americans who had broken cover. Two GIs dropped immediately, one spinning backward into the mud, the other crumpling silently as water pooled around him. The American staff sergeant, a cigarette clenched between his teeth only moments before, spat it into the rain and barked new orders. Take cover, get behind the wrecks. His voice carried over the storm, steady even as his men fell. He knew what the MG-42 could do if left unchecked. The squad scattered, some diving into the shelter of overturned carts, others pressing into the narrow alleyways behind the church. The sergeant himself slammed against the side of an abandoned truck, assessing quickly, his mind racing. The enemy had the high ground now, and in the rain-blurred chaos, every second mattered. The MG-42 dominated the street, its bursts cutting through the fog and rain with terrifying precision. From above, its arcs of fire raked the Americans, pinning them in place, daring them to rise. "Second team, flank right." "Grenadier with me," the sergeant shouted, pointing sharply toward a narrow alley that looped behind the church. Two men nodded and slipped away, disappearing into the gray veil. The sergeant turned back to the rest. "The rest of you suppress that tower. Pour it on." Garand snapped upward, their rounds clanging against stone-chipping chunks from the tower's walls. The bar hammered steadily, its bursts tracing lines of fire that forced the MG-42 gunners to duck for cover. Yet the German squad leader was quick to counter. He pushed men to reinforce the base of the church, their rifles firing from the broken windows, keeping the Americans pinned even as the machine gun adjusted. The rain intensified, plastering hair to forehead, soaking through field jackets, turning every motion into a test of will. Rifles jammed from water magazines slipped from wet hands, boots squelched in the mud. Yet the fight went on, stubborn and brutal. Inside the church, shadows moved. The two Americans who had slipped into the rear crept up a narrow staircase, their Garands clutched tight, their boots creaked against soaked wood, each sound amplified in their ears. Above them, the MG-42 rattled again, the vibration of its fire shaking the very stones. They were close now, close enough to hear the German gunners' shouted words, close enough to smell the acrid tang of gunpowder mixed with wet plaster. Then came the chance. A German rifleman guarding the stairwell spotted them and raised his weapon. A shot rang out, echoing in the confined space, and the lead American staggered, clutching his side. But his comrade reacted instantly. He leaned out, sighted, and fired. The bolt-action rifleman fell backward, tumbling down the steps, his weapon clattering against stone. The surviving American pressed forward, lungs, burning hands slick on his rifle. He reached the top just as the MG-42's loader leaned down for another belt. Without hesitation, he fired. The loader collapsed, blood splattering against the wall. The gunner swung around his hand, still gripping the weapon's spade handles, but he was too slow. A second shot cracked, and the gunner jerked back, his body sliding off the seat. Then silence. The MG-42 was dead. Outside, the battlefield shifted instantly. The Americans, freed from the buzzsaw's grip, surged forward. Grenades flew into windows, detonating with concussive force. Rifle fire hammered the German positions, forcing them to scatter. The Bayar unleashed its full fury bursts, chewing into the stone walls, suppressing every shadow that moved. The German squad leader, realizing the collapse, shouted desperately. His MP-40 sprang toward the advancing Americans. But leadership alone could not conjure firepower. His men fell around him, one struck by a grenade shrapnel, another by a Garand round that punched through his cover. The rain ran red down the stones as his formation broke apart. Then came the final blow. From the bell tower, now abandoned by its gunners, came a muffled shout in German panic confusion, and then the boom of a hand grenade. The explosion shook the tower, cracking stone weakened by rain and battle. With a groan like a wounded beast, the tower leaned, then collapsed in a thunder of rubble, crushing the ground below. The Germans broke. Those who could still stand fled into the storm, their rifles abandoned, their courage drowned. The rest surrendered their hands, raised their eyes hollow. The American squad, battered but unbroken, regrouped in the street. The sergeant stood tall despite the mud clinging to his uniform. He lit another cigarette with shaking hands, shielding the flame from the rain. His eyes scanned his men, the wounded carried by their comrades. The dead lay gently aside, the living too exhausted to speak. They had won, barely. The simulation tallied its numbers. The Americans had endured heavy losses, but they had neutralized the MG-42, adapted to the shifting chaos, and forced the Germans to break. It was a narrow margin, but a margin nonetheless. In the cold calculus of probability, the Americans emerged superior, winning 54% of engagements compared to Germany's 46%. A slim edge, but an edge all the same. And yet to the men who had fought in this imagined rain numbers meant nothing. What mattered was survival. What mattered was that they had stood against the most fearsome weapon of the war and endured. The rain fell harder, washing the blood into the gutters, carrying it away. The battle was over, but the question lingered. Superiority was not dominance. It was resilience. The rain drummed harder now, beating a rhythm against helmets and stone, masking the scrape of boots and the ragged gasps of men. The ruined church loomed over the street like a wounded sentinel, its cracked bell tower swaying slightly with each burst of wind. Inside, the Germans had made their stand, and from its jagged heights, the MG-42 barked anew. Its bursts cut through the rain like lightning tracer rounds, slicing streaks of red across the gray curtain. Each line of fire pinned the Americans in place, forcing them down into puddles that splashed cold water into their eyes. The buzzsaw of the MG-42 was more than sound, it was pressure, it was fear. Every man who dared lift his head felt its gaze, its promise of instant death. The American staff sergeant crouched behind the rusted hulk of an overturned truck, lit another cigarette with hands that only trembled once the match had burned out. He watched the tracers arc, listened to the intervals of the bursts. The Germans were firing in controlled rhythms, their squad leader still alive, directing with the precision of experience. His men were faltering. 2 had already been cut down in the open. Another pressed his hand to a wound in his neck, blood seeping between his fingers as he choked on rainwater and copper. The sergeant clenched his jaw. If they stayed pinned, the MG-42 would finish them one by one. He leaned out, just enough to catch the eye of his grenadier. "You and the riflemen back through the alley. Get around behind that tower. The rest of us keep their heads down." The grenadier nodded, grabbed the shoulder of a younger GI, and slipped into the alley. Their silhouettes vanished into the mist, leaving the rest to endure the storm of lead. "Suppress that gun!" the sergeant roared. His Thompson rose, spitting bursts into the gray. The bar joined in its heavy rounds, hammering the stone around the machine gun's nest. Garands cracked their pinging clips, falling into puddles. The volume of fire grew not accurate, but overwhelming, daring the Germans to pause. Above them, the MG-42 answered. Its muzzle flashes lit the tower's broken windows, its bursts carving through the rain. Stone chipped and cracked under the onslaught. A ricochet sparked off the sergeant's truck, showering him with slivers of metal. Still, he didn't flinch. Inside the church, the German squad leader barked sharp commands. He had seen this tactic before. Americans always sought to outflank, always tried to break the spine of his machine gun. He directed riflemen to cover the rear approaches, sent 2 men down the nave to intercept any who dared sneak into the sanctuary. He was confident. His MG-42 still roared, his men still obeyed, and the rain, relentless as it was, worked in his favor, slowing American advances, jamming weapons, sapping strength. But confidence is brittle under fire. At the base of the tower, the grenadier and the young rifleman crept through a side door, boots silent on the soaked wooden planks. The church's interior smelled of mildew and burned incense, its pews shattered, its altar broken. They slipped past statues riddled with bullet holes, their rifles raised every step an echo in their ears. From above came the vibrations of the MG-42 rattling the timbers, shaking plaster from the ceiling. The loader shouted something in German, his voice muffled but urgent. The Americans exchanged a glance. They were close now. Outside, the sergeant held his ground. He fired short bursts from his Thompson, each magazine emptied quickly, each reload slower than the last. His men followed suit, pouring their ammunition into the tower's windows. They weren't trying to kill, they were trying to buy time. The Germans responded with fury. Rifle shots cracked from the nave, forcing the Americans lower. One man, too slow to duck, slumped forward into the mud, a neat hole drilled into his helmet. The sergeant growled low in his throat, refusing to let grief interrupt the rhythm. Inside the tower, the grenadier and riflemen reached the staircase. Its steps groaned under their weight, each creak a warning to those above. The rifleman flinched, gripping his weapon tighter, but the grenadier pressed forward, his jaw set. They climbed slowly, steadily, until the loader's boots came into view at the top. The grenadier raised his Garand, sighted, and fired. The loader collapsed with a cry, tumbling backward, his belt of ammunition spilling like a ribbon down the stairs. The gunner swung frantic, his hands still clutching the MG-42's grips. He fired blindly, the rounds smashing into the wall, chipping stone, filling the stairwell with dust. The rifleman ducked heart-pounding, and the grenadier fired again. This time, the gunner slumped sideways, the buzzsaw of the MG-42 falling silent. The silence was not total. Outside rifles still cracked, and the storm still roared. But to the Americans pinned in the street, that silence was liberation. They looked at one another in disbelief as the relentless stream of bullets ceased. For the first time in minutes, they could breathe. The sergeant seized the moment. "Advance," he bellowed. His men rose from cover, Garands raised and surged toward the church. Grenades arced through shattered windows, their blasts shaking the nave. The bar gunner, teeth clenched, advanced with his weapon blazing, forcing the remaining Germans back deeper into the ruins. The German squad leader, realizing the peril, drew his MP-40 and fired desperately. His burst tore through the rain, striking one American who fell with a cry. But it was too late. The Americans closed in rifles, snapping bayonets, thrusting grenades, bursting. The church became a slaughterhouse. Shouts in English and German mingled with the clash of steel and the crash of grenades. Rifle butts smashed into jaws, boots stamped on hands clutching weapons bayonets, found flesh in the shadows of the pews. It was short, brutal, and decisive. Then came the sound that ended it, the thunder of collapsing stone. The grenade that had silenced the MG-42 had also cracked the weakened tower further. Rain and fire had done the rest. With a groan like the moan of a dying giant, the bell tower swayed, then fell crashing into the nave. Dust and debris filled the air, drowning shouts, burying men beneath tons of stone. When the dust cleared, the Germans were broken. Their leader lay lifeless, his MP-40 still clutched in his hand. The few survivors threw down their weapons, raising trembling hands in surrender. The Americans, fewer now than when they had begun, stood amid the wreckage, their faces pale, their uniforms soaked to their rifles still warm. The sergeant pulled another cigarette from his pocket, though the rain quickly dampened it. He smiled bitterly, struck a match and lit it anyway, shielding the flame with cupped hands. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled into the storm. His men watched him, exhausted but alive. They had taken the high ground. They had silenced the MG-42. They had survived. But at what cost? Bodies lay everywhere, American and German alike, their blood mingling in the rain, carried away in thin red streams along the gutters. Helmets bobbed in puddles, rifles lay abandoned in mud, bayonets bent and broken. The high ground had been claimed, but it had demanded everything. The historians who later tallied the numbers would write it cleanly. The Americans triumphed here, their adaptability and distributed firepower overcoming German discipline and machine gun doctrine. But the soldiers who had fought in this simulation knew another truth. Victory was not triumph. It was survival, nothing more. And as the sergeant looked at the broken tower, now reduced to rubble, he muttered words that carried through the rain. High ground's worth nothing if no one's left to stand on it. Rain hammered the ruined street, drumming against helmets and splintered walls. The American squad, already ragged from the ambush, now found themselves pinned in a deadly crossfire. The German squad leader, quick to seize an opportunity, pushed his men out from the sanctuary of the church. With sharp orders, he concentrated their fire on an overturned truck where the American staff sergeant crouched with two riflemen. The wooden frame shuddered under the impact of round splinters flying with each strike. The sergeant gritted his teeth. The truck was their shield, but it was also a magnet for bullets. He watched one man flinch as shards cut across his cheek, another recoil as a round punched through the metal inches from his head. They couldn't hold here. Across the line, the German NCO split his attention. Some riflemen kept hammering the truck, determined to finish the pinned Americans. Others turned to the alley where a second group of US soldiers had advanced too far in the rain. For a moment, the Germans held all the cards, two targets, two angles of attack, and the MG-42 above still spitting bursts into the gray. The Americans' response came in a rush of calculation under fire. The sergeant forced himself to breathe to steady his vision. He had seconds to decide, protect the men at his side, or divert every ounce of firepower against the MG-42, the weapon that chained them down. He knew the truth. As long as that gun kept roaring, every decision was just a delay before death. "Forget the riflemen," he shouted, voice raw. "Put everything on the tower." Garands lifted from cover their muzzles, sparking in the rain. The bar shifted, its operator lying prone in the mud bursts, hammering up toward the bell tower windows. The sound of their return fire rose like defiance against the storm. One American rifleman whispered a prayer as he sighted in rain dripping from the tip of his bayonet. Another clenched his jaw, thinking of home as he worked the trigger faster than he ever had in training. Each man knew what hung in the balance: focus fire on the MG42 or be cut down one by one in the mud. For the Germans, the gamble was clear. Their squad leader barked for his men to hold the line to keep pressing both targets, but by dividing their attention, they risked losing control. The Americans had found their point of unity. They would bet everything on silencing the gun above. The battle teetered on that razor's edge. One side divided, the other desperate, but focused. In rain and fire, every second stretched long enough to feel like eternity. In the chaos outside, two Americans slipped through a side door of the church, unseen in the haze. They were young, their faces pale with fear, yet hardened by necessity. One clutched his Garand so tightly his knuckles blanched. The other carried the weight of a grenadier's launcher across his back. Their orders were simple but near suicidal: take the tower from within. They crept through the broken nave, the smell of damp plaster and burned wood filling their lungs. Every step up the wooden stairs felt like thunder in their ears. Above them, the MG42 rattled its vibration, humming through the stones, a death drone that never ceased. Suddenly, shouts in German. The squad leader had spotted them. 3 riflemen rushed to intercept boots clattering on the steps. The Americans froze for a heartbeat. Then instinct took over. The grenadier leveled his rifle and fired. The first German staggered backward, tumbling into his comrades. The narrow stairwell exploded in sound as both sides exchanged frantic shots. The rifleman ducked around, grazing his helmet with a shriek. He pressed himself flat, heart pounding, ears ringing. The grenadier reappeared, snapping off another shot. The second German collapsed, sliding down the steps with his Kar 98K clattering beside him. The last enemy tried to return fire, cycling his bolt with trembling hands. But the American rifleman, emboldened, now rose and fired point blank. The shot echoed in the confined space, and silence fell. Breathless, the 2 Americans pressed upward, smoke stinging their eyes. They reached the top just as the MG42's loader bent over the gun, fumbling with another belt. The grenadier didn't hesitate. His round struck the man squarely. The gunner spun desperate, but a Garand cracked again and he fell. The MG42 went silent. For the first time in minutes, the battlefield breathed. The Americans had done the impossible, silencing the weapon that had turned the street into a killing field. 2 men acting with courage beyond measure had shifted the fate of their squad. Outside, their comrades seized the chance. The sergeant roared for his men to advance, and through rain and smoke, they surged toward the church, Garand's flashing bayonets lowered. The tide had turned thanks to the gamble of 2 soldiers who climbed into death's very mouth and returned alive. The German squad leader, seeing his men falter, pushed out of the nave in a desperate counter. He shouted for discipline, for fire on the flanking Americans. His MP40 sprayed bullets carving the air, but even his voice could not hold chaos together. The sergeant barked for every rifle to hammer the tower to finish the job. Then it happened. A grenade tossed high and blind landed at the base of the bell tower. The explosion ripped through already weakened stone. The tower groaned, tilted, and collapsed in a roar that shook the village. Dust and debris cascaded onto Germans below, crushing bodies, scattering survivors. Screams echoed, then faded into silence. The Germans broke. Some fled into the rain. Others threw down their rifles, hands raised in surrender. The Americans, bleeding and battered, stumbled into the ruins, their boots crunching over plaster and glass. The sergeant, forehead bandaged, lit a match with trembling fingers. He checked his men, too few now. One groaned with a stomach wound, another sat pale and hollow-eyed. The Texan leaned against a wall, chest heaving, grenade belt empty. Around them lay the cost of survival. The rain eased into a mist, drifting over shattered walls and broken glass. Smoke clung stubbornly to the ruins of the church, curling upward like the memory of gunfire that refused to die. The American squad, what was left of it, huddled in silence, tending to wounds, whispering names of the fallen. Their sergeant leaned heavily on a wall match, trembling as he lit a final cigarette. It was not triumph that hung in the air, but exhaustion. Survival had come at a terrible price. And yet, in the quiet tally of the simulation, survival was enough. The numbers spoke with cold clarity. The Americans prevailed in 54% of engagements, the Germans in 46%, a margin so slim it could vanish in the fog of war. Yet even the smallest edge mattered, for in real battlefields, that edge meant who advanced to the next village and who was left behind in the mud. The lesson was unmistakable. The German squad, disciplined, lethal, anchored by the MG-42, was devastating when its machine gun rained unchecked. But when that weapon fell silent, when their leader was lost, cohesion cracked. The American squad, scattered, bleeding, and often clumsy under fire, endured by virtue of adaptability. Semi-automatic rifles and every-hand initiative drilled into every man. A doctrine of fire and movement, these were their lifeline. Neither side was invincible. Both suffered, both bled, and both proved that war at its core was not a contest of machines alone, but of men pushed to their limits. As the last embers of the fight faded, the narrator's voice lingered with a question. This was only one duel, July 1944, France squad against squad. But history is filled with such encounters. Legion against phalanx, archer against musketeer, samurai against knight. Which clash should we bring into the crucible next? The screen darkened, leaving the audience with the echo of rain on stone, the hiss of fading smoke, and the haunting truth that even in simulations, victory was never clean. It was survival bought with blood.